medieval Punjab, evaluating the role of local elements, 1400 to 1600. This paper has an introduction and it is followed by 4 chronological phases of roughly 50 years each. At the outset, I would say a few words about the rationale behind this paper. Most of the Persian chronicles, which are our only source of evidence for the political history, they generally legitimize the state. And they have a very strong bias against the local elements that were opposed to the state. Many times I find that the local elements, they were condemned, cursed, demonized, and even silenced. Now this particular stance of the chronicles, it often distorts our own understanding in these times. But the local elements, I feel they have their own side of the story which needs to be placed on board. A few features of the local elements, they can be identified through some of them. For example, they have strong roots in the countryside. They've been existing for centuries, independent of the state. They possessed power, wealth, and influence. They also had military resources in the form of militia, which was composed of their particular clans. And we find that these local elements, sometimes they collaborated with the state, sometimes they resisted, depending on their interests. But I must point out that these local elements, they did not form a single well-knit class, because there are several layers. For example, we find that there are Rajput rulers of the kingdoms on the eastern forming the eastern boundary of Punjab. There were tribal chiefs who headed these tribes: Kokars, Gakhars, Balochis, Langas, Mandahars, and so on. There were intermediaries in well-settled areas. Surprisingly, or not surprisingly, they had many times Muslim names with the prefix Rai. I leave you to ponder on this. And at the lowest level, you had the village headmen who were referred to as Muqaddam, Rais, and Sardar. And all these 4 classes, if you wish to see them in a single passage, I request you to read the escape of Mirza Kamran from the Afghan custody when he rushed out and travelled between Satluj and Jhelum along the foothills of Punjab till he was betrayed by Adam Khan Gakhar. That is a very interesting episode in the history of this region. Now, in the part 1 of this paper, I have discussed the role of local elements in the invasion of Timur and afterwards. When Timur passed through this region, many a times he found that the village headmen, these are the words which are used in the day-to-day account by Sharfuddin Ali Yazdi. ये अल्फाज हैं, मुकद्दम, रईस, सरदार. उसमें कहा गया है कि that on the borders of India, that is Hudud-e-Hind, they tried to resist the invaders, but since they were not so strong, therefore they submitted so that they are able to protect their homes and huts. After the departure of Timur from this region back to Central Asia, we find that the muktis who were posted in different parts of Punjab, they find themselves independent, and they are fighting amongst themselves so that they were able to make a bid for the throne of Delhi. Take the example of the tussle between Khazar Khan and Mallu Iqbal Khan. And in this tussle, we find that the local elements, they waited and watched and did not get involved in this. But in this period, what I find is that there were three major challenges for Delhi Sultanate. First, the revolt of nobles who were known as Turk Bachas in the Sis-Satluj tract. Second, Jasrat Khokar, who often raided the plains of Punjab. And third, Sheikh Ali of Kabul, who is very frequently found intruding into the towns and cities of western Punjab. Now, in the official campaigns of the Delhi Sultanate, in order to meet these three challenges, they always made it a point to rope in the support of the local elements. Let us take a look at their names. Fortunately, their habitat is also mentioned. For example, Rai Kamaluddin Main of Ludhiana and his son Rai Firoz Main, Rai Juljan Bhatti and his son Rai Hinnu Bhatti, Rai Dawood of Jalandhar, Rai Ghalib of Kalanor, Raja Bhim of Jammu. We find that these elements, their support was absolutely indispensable for the state in order to meet the challenges, at least in the first half of the 15th century. Now, what we find is, if we look back at the role of the local elements, poor fellows, they were caught in a crossfire between the Delhi Sultanate and the challenges we have talked about. And because of this, they had to pay a very heavy price of this. I give you two examples. Jasrat Khokar, he killed Raja Bhim of Jammu, and Folad Turk Bacha, he killed Rai Firoz Main, just mentioned. Now, I move on to part 2 of this paper. Now, in this, I discuss the rise of the new rulers in Sarhind, Malerkotla, and Multan. First, the rise of the Lodhis. Now, many of us already know that the rise of the Lodhis has to be seen in the context of pastoral nomadism, horse trade, and migration of the Afghans to different parts of northern India. And a large number of them, at least 12,000 have been mentioned, who converged at Sarhind, and we can suggest that it virtually became an Afghan colony. And when Behlor Lodi, who was originally a horse trader and a nephew of Islam Khan Lodi, who was the Mukti of Sarhind, he maintained many troops for the Sayyid ruler, and in return he received a large number of iktas between Lahore to Delhi. And if we look at the support base of Behlor Lodi, we find that he was not really relying on the local elements. In fact, he was relying on the support, the ethnic support of these Afghans in order to attain supreme power. In this period, something very interesting, very unusual and exceptional happened, and that was two Sufis became rulers. Yes. One in Malerkotla and the other in Multan. Although these two regions are separated by more than 300 miles, but there are certain features that are common between the two. That is Haider Sheikh and Yusuf Qureshi. These are the points which are common between them. First, both of them, they were closely associated with the Suravardi order. Number two, both of them formed alliances with the local zamindars in order to acquire military resources. And third, we find that both of them were matrimonially linked with Behlol Lodi. Now, in these two cases, the similarity ends very quickly, and we find that as their story unfolds, we find that this experiment of transforming a Sufi into a ruler, it succeeded in the case of Malerkotla, but it did not succeed in the case of Multan, and there are concrete reasons for this. The ruler of Malerkotla, that is Haider Sheikh, he was able to consolidate. Now, let me remind ourselves that the Sufis did have spiritual authority in their regions, but they lacked something else, which was very important, and that was military resources. And in order to fill what they were lacking, what they did was they roped in. They formed alliances with the powerful zamindars, and we have a number of examples. I would not go into the details because that would take a lot of time. In the case of Yusuf Qureshi of Multan, we find that his main supporter, the Langa chief, whose name was Rai Sira, he betrayed him, and through a very dubious kind of a conspiracy, he was able to dislodge this man Yusuf Qureshi from Multan, and he was able to lay the foundation of the Langa kingdom. And Qureshi, in spite of the help of Behlol Lodi, he was not able to get his position back in Multan. And the important role of the local elements is once again, it becomes visible in the early part of the 16th century, when the Langa kingdom, it was divided into two parts, that is, one part under Sultan Mahmud and the other part under Jam Bayezid, and we find that both of them, again, in order to consolidate their position, they were trying to take the support of the Balochi and Tattawa tribes. So, in the early 16th century, this is the position. When we move to the third part, I have discussed the local resistance which was offered by the local elements in the first half of the 16th century. This portion, it begins with Guru Nanak's critical observations on the contemporary state. We find that these observations, they are very clearly reflected in the political developments that unfold in the first half of the 16th century. Now we find that the ruling classes, they relied less on negotiations and more on force. This was not the case earlier, and also later on we find that the things are different. But this period of almost 50 years, that's the first half of the 16th century, it stands out for the great magnitude of violence which is inflicted on the local elements by the Afghan state, and to an extent even by the Mughals. The pressure on the local communities, it increases to a great extent, and let me, without going into the details, I would identify some of the main features of this pressure which was inflicted on the local elements, as I'm pointing out. First, forts were constructed at Rohtas and Mankot, in order to suppress the opposition of these elements. Number two, military operations at this period are very long. They extend to months and years. Although earlier and afterwards we would find that these operations would be over in a few days or in a few weeks. But now this is something unusual. I did not find it before or after. And I find that the magnitude and intensity of violence and destruction has increased during this period. And which is somewhat unfortunate, there are at least 2 cases of genocide. Please note, first, the Mandahars of Kathal are totally wiped out in 1529. And then the Sumbals, they are a branch of the Niazis whose habitat was on the Indus. They were also totally wiped out. It is very difficult. Once you start reading the account, it is very depressing and distressing because you do not find that kind of bloodshed, destruction, hatred, bitterness unusual. This is the vindication of Guru Nanak, isn't it? Yes. And when we move to the Multan region, we find that there was a lot of armed resistance to the Afghan state, and this resistance had a very wide social base. For example, we find the involvement of the Balochis, the Jats, and Langas. All of them were involved at the same time. It appears they had very strong differences on the magnitude of the tribute or the land revenue which Sher Shah was trying to impose in the region. The military commander Haibat Khan Niazi, who was sent to the Multan region in order to establish peace and order. And again, the account indicates a lot of violence, and there is excessive use of force in the operations, which continued again for a long time near Pakpatan. And we find that one of the examples which I must mention is that one of the Baloch chiefs, whose name is Mindu Baloch, he had to kill the women in his own camp so that these women did not fall into the hands of the Afghans. Now, we find that when the Afghans were able to suppress and crush the rebels, the Afghan state did a U-turn, and they agreed that from now onwards we would be collecting the land revenue according to the system which prevailed in the time of the Langas, that is, assessment on the basis of a share in the produce, and certainly not on the basis of measurement of land, that is Jarib. Now the question arises, if the state was willing to make this accommodation, why did they inflict so much of misery on the people in so many months preceding this decision? And in the same time, that is the first half of the 16th century, we find that 2 tribal groups, that is Gakhars and Niazis, they joined hands to fight against the Afghan state, and the military operations which were carried out under Islam Shah, they continued for 2 long years. Again, very surprising and exceptional. And these operations again were marked by a lot of cruelty and repression. And it far exceeded even by the medieval standards. Recently, Andre Wink has come out with his latest book, Al-Hind Volume 4, in which he has attributed the fall of the Afghan state to internal dissensions. I would disagree with him, because when I read the evidence of the period, I feel that the real reason for the problems of the Afghan state was its failure or inability to compromise with the local elements, particularly on the question of magnitude of the tributes. It appears that the Afghan state had lost the art of making negotiated settlements with groups that had deep roots in their localities. And this failure of the Afghan state, it would have important lessons for the Mughals in the next phase I'm going to talk about. And friends, let us, I have drawn up a list of the rebel leaders who were killed. Now their names were Mohan Mandahar, Pirana Janjua, Sarang Khan Gakhad, Fateh Khan Jat, Mindu Baloch, Raja Takhmal of Mau, Raja Jaichand of Kangra. These last two names, they fall in the next period. Now if you read the details, the manner in which they were killed and the manner in which the dead bodies were treated, that is again extremely exceptional. One feels that the state could have been more patient, diplomatic and humane. They could have negotiated alliances with these groups which had deep historical, social and cultural roots in their areas. They could have convinced these groups that you would get a number of benefits if you compromise with the state. And friends, this was certainly not impractical, because even before this period and after this period, there are so many examples of friendly compromises, accommodations. But I find that the first half of the 16th century, it stands out for the intensity of violence, atrocities, bloodshed, destruction. Part 4, experience of the Mughal state in Punjab. I pointed out if there were any lessons which the Mughals could learn. I find that in the second half of the 16th century, which coincides with the reign of Akbar, we find that these lessons were learned only partially. Of course, the master stroke of Akbar was the winning over of the Gakhads. There was a limited military action, and the domain of the Gakhads, it was divided first into two parts, and then Adam Khan Gakhad, he was entirely removed, and the entire principality, it was handed over to Kamal Khan Gakhad. Now, even more important is that this man, Kamal, and 5 of his relatives, they were assimilated into the Mughal state. And if we read the history, the kind of contribution which these 6 Gakhad gentlemen, they made to the consolidation of the Mughal rule, I find that the Mughals were able to derive at least 4 benefits from their accommodation with the Gakhads. 1, the Mughals were able to keep the Lahore-Kabul route safe. Number 2, the Mughal state was able to keep the trans-Indus Afghan tribes in check. Number 3, the Mughal state did not allow Mirza Hakim to occupy Punjab in spite of his several incursions. And number 4, the Mughal state was able to assert its jurisdiction over large parts of Afghanistan. Now, this kind of success which the Mughal state was able to get as a result of their alliance with the Dakhars, unfortunately, that could not be replicated on the eastern side because we find that in the number of hill principalities, particularly between Satluj and the Chenab, they were continuously I should say, they were in a state of rebellion, a perpetual state of rebellion, sometimes collectively, sometimes individually, in spite of the fact that Akbar was able to subjugate Jasrota, Lakhanpur and Kangra. Again, the military operations, they continued for at least 4 decades. And in spite of these long drawn-out conflicts, we find that the Mughal presence in the hills of Punjab, it remained limited, weak and temporary. Outstanding example would be Raja Basu of Mao. Now, and this brings us to the presence of Akbar in the Punjabi folklore. I have 2 examples for you. One, the Qissa of Dulla Bhatti. If we read it, we find, now this text, it portrays Akbar as a bad ruler whose land revenue it was so regressive that the peasantry of Rachna Dwab was constrained to rise up in revolt, and this ballad, it preserves the collective memory of the resistance which was put forward by the 3 generations of these Patti Zamindars who had just 12 villages under their control, and Akbar not only got them killed in a cruel manner, but he also meted out a very inhuman treatment to their dead bodies. And as a result, Dulla Bhatti, he became a permanent symbol of resistance and therefore an important ingredient of the cultural ethos of medieval Punjab. The other text is Heer Damodar. Again, it is very surprising that Akbar has been mentioned 17 times in Heer Damodar, and the poet is somewhat kind to Akbar, and it notes the increasing presence of Akbar in the countryside of Punjab, but at the same time, the Jat clans, they are not scared, they are not unduly worried because they control large chunks of land and they have a lot of military resources at their command, and they were strong enough to compete with Akbar in the exercise of power at the grassroots level. So there is a considerable difference between the attitude of these 2 texts which I have talked about. And friends, in view of the importance of Heer Damodar for understanding the social structure, local politics, and cultural diversity in medieval Punjab, I have brought out its English translation along with a context and analysis. In conclusion, I would like to say that if we wish to understand medieval Punjab, we are bound to trace the changing rule of the local elements in relation to the medieval state, be it collaboration, be it resistance, be it neutrality, this would pave the way for a inclusive approach to medieval past, which also promises to embrace the rich socio-cultural diversity of the region. Thank you.